Have you heard the story of the man who lived like a rumor? They called him Saanjh, not because he liked sunsets. He barely noticed colors anymore, but because the hour between light and dark felt honest. In that thin, liminal time, the city loosened its suit and pretended to be ordinary. Street vendors stacked their steel carts. Last rickshaw wallahs hustled for fares, and people hurried home with their small, private freights of grief and relief. Saanjh liked the brief forgetting. It suited him. People whispered about him in the chowls and on the midnight buses. A silhouette, a laugh that slipped like oil, a hand that felt colder than the night. The newspapers would later print a face, a telescope of features. But for months before that, he was only a rumor threaded through the city's alleys. He moved like a thought that didn't belong to anybody. Sudden, invasive, impossible to pin down. One day in mid-2010, Inspector Arjun Varma received a call from the Chowpatty police. Come see something interesting. The officer on the phone said nothing like the victim. No name, no trophy. Just a watchman who dozed for one oblivious sweep. Inspector Varan said, "That's the thing," he said to his small team, as they mapped the incidents on the metal board in the precinct. Pins, yarn, coffee stains. There is method in the madness, but it's not theirs. He doesn't want fame. He wants interruption. He was right, in a way. Saanjh loved interruptions. He loved to make a life falter for a breath. He liked the exact point at which someone S-script hiccuped a kettle. S-whistle, later child's delayed homework. Because in that pause, in that unplanned vacancy, he could see the person more clearly than daylight ever let him see them. He wasn't violent for the thrill of brutality. He did not keep the objects of his harm, like the old men kept coins. He watched with the patient curiosity of someone trying to understand the shape of a mechanism. After it was over, he cleaned the edges of things, as if to erase his own fingerprints from a world he considered only borrowed. Inside his one-room flat behind a chemist, Saanjh kept a small ledger. No names, just moments, dates, and the minutiae he collected. The angle of a lamp, the pattern of a bruise, whether the street dog barked that night. It read like a botanist's field notes. He thought of people as specimens that refused to be catalogued. Each entry was a question. Each question asked him where he fit into the world. For Arjun, the job became personal because of how ordinary the killings were. You cannot keep a case in the abstract when grief knocks on your neighbor's door. His own sister, Meera, sold vegetables at a corner stall. She began to lock the sack of cash in a tiffin box. Arjun grew watchful in a city that had learned new ways to be afraid. He began walking home late, not to chase the killer, but to understand the hour when he himself might become a story on someone else's board. Weeks bled into one another. Saanjh always seemed one step ahead of detection. He knew the rhythm of police rotations, the taste of predictable routines. And yet, for all his planning, he made mistakes that were small and human. A cigarette butt dropped in a lane. A stray neighbor who remembered seeing a man in a blue shawl. The city keeps its own ledger too. A ledger of gossip, of market exchange, of eyes that remember. Then one day, Arjun found the first real break in a camera at a pawn shop. The footage did not show the act. CCTV's eyes are honest in their limitedness. They see only angles, not meanings. But it did show a man who lingered too long outside a building where a killing had occurred. He was nondescript, his face between shadows, yet his hands were part of the story. For the first time, the investigator felt the cold twinge that comes before a not until. They called him Saanjh in the press once the sketches were made public, because a poet at the paper liked the sound of it. That name stuck to the case like dust to wet paint. Arjun hated the name and loved the way it made the city tremble. Both responses were part of the same uncomfortable honesty. The cat and mouse spiraled. Sanjay's handwriting, when they found it in a paper wrapper near a scene, was independent of vanity. He left nothing that shouted. He left behind the small pauses, the silent littleness of a life interrupted. And Arjun grew sharper. He stopped sleeping in tidy blocks, lived like someone half in a dream, listening for rhythms that might mimic the killer's. One night, Arjun found himself walking the lanes of the city at dawn. He had failed to close a lead. The street smelled of boiled potato and incense. He almost missed the figure, until the man was close enough to be a shadow with movements. "You're awake early," Arjun said, and meant it like the bar of a tram opening. The man, he looked smaller, up close, turned. There was a softness to his face, an unremarkable geometry that made it almost hard to anchor suspicion. His gaze slid from Arjun's eyes to the wall clock, then to the pile of newspapers. "Saint?" Arjun asked, because he had to ask. The man laughed, but it felt more like a cough. "Names are for waking things," he said. "But you already know me." Arjun didn't reach for his gun. He reached for the space between words, for the place where a man would reveal his shape. Why? He asked. Why them? The man looked at Arjun with that thin, detailed interest, like someone studying the stitch on a suit. Because they stopped noticing the little doors, he said. Because they lived in the idea of their lives instead of inside them. It was not an answer. It was a doorway. Saanjh spoke like someone reading an old map. He offered bits and fragments, as if scattering seeds and seeing what sprouted. Sometimes, when Arjun listened too long, the inspector felt a strange, dangerous kinship. The way Saanjh described the city's habits, its soft missteps, its careless habits. It was the same language Arjun used to diagnose crimes. The difference was the thing they did with that knowledge. That night changed the case for Arjun because it planted a mirror in his mind. Saanjh did not act from fury alone. He acted from a curatorial obsession. He believed he was editing a sloppy anthology, trimming the sentences that annoyed him. The word psycho hardly sufficed. There was a coolness to Saanjh's cruelty that made it philosophical as a blade. They arrested him 3 nights later, in a house near the river, sitting cross-legged on the floor with a cup of tea gone cold. His arrest was almost ceremonial because his ledger was there, open like a book. No names, just the same notes, the same patient observations. The city exhaled. For a week, the air tasted less metallic. At the trial, the room was full of people who wanted plain stories. They wanted motives like neat umbrellas, greed, jealousy, revenge. Saanjh offered them none. He sat sometimes with his head tipped, sometimes humming to himself. And when the court asked him whether he felt remorse, he said, "Remorse is the luxury of those who never had to cut away the rot to save the rest." The psychiatrists offered labels. The crowds offered rage. Arjun found himself watching Saanjh during recess, noticing the man's hands, as if he could learn something from their quietness. He wondered if catching Saanjh had changed anything.